Hello, good evening. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Tuesday, February 17th, 2026. The time is 6 p.m., and I am in Miami, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is Part B of Cuba, Terrorism, and the Gangstalking Connection, Part 10, Political Contrivances. And I'll have you know, ladies and gentlemen, that I tend to do these lectures outdoors, and I may have to raise or project my voice from time to time to drown out the background noise. Please adjust your volumes accordingly, and thank you for listening. Ladies and gentlemen, we're exploring Cuba's role in international narco-terrorism. I consider this to be a very important issue because, quite frankly, there are a lot of silent Cuban-American dissidents right here in the United States. Not every person here of Cuban descent is in love with Cuba. There are a lot of Cuban Americans here that consider Cuba to be a tyrannical dictatorship and a total boon to the global community. And we're going to talk about some of these topics and issues, ladies and gentlemen. Cuba is only 115 miles from Miami-Dade County, and it's important to understand these issues from the perspective of a person who lives and resides in Miami-Dade County. I believe that the Cuban people here enjoy my work. I think they value my work. And indeed, the Cuban American population here in the great state of Florida appreciate my work and the expose that I have done on Cuba. There are people in Miami-Dade County whose hearts bleed for the Cubans who are stuck over in Cuba, and the daily dread routine of waking up every day knowing that there's simply just not enough prosperity in the country that you live in every day. And the Cuban population here in Miami-Dade County is truly grateful and appreciative of the work that I do concerning clandestine gang stalking and concerning my exposés on Cuba. And the reason is because I think a lot of the Cuban American population here and the Jamaican American and Haitian American populations here in Miami-Dade County don't realize that what they are experiencing, a lot of them on a daily basis, is clandestine gang stalking. And the Cuban American population, the Jamaican population, and the Haitian population of Miami-Dade County are appreciative of my work, and they tune in regularly so that they can get a daily dose of truth, virtue, and civil freedoms right here on social media, right here on the EIS Media Group Lecture Series, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to continue with Nicaragua. And we're going to read a number of paragraphs, and we're going to do a breakdown because a lot of what we're reading here, ladies and gentlemen, is directly tied to clandestine gang stalking and its auspices. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to begin. Castro has counseled the Sandinistas to protect their Western ties to keep the country afloat economically, but to ensure that the FSLN could move to dominate the Nicaraguan government, Cuba has acted quickly to build up Sandinista military and security forces. Since July 1979, Cuba has provided substantial military, technical, and political assistance. Some 5,000 Cuban advisors, teachers, and medical personnel work at all levels of the military and civilian infrastructures. Of this number, more than 1,500 military and security advisors are actively providing military instruction and combat training instruction in intelligence and counterintelligence activities, instruction on security protection for the FSLN leadership, and advice on organization of the Nicaraguan police force. In addition, Nicaragua has received within the past year approximately $28 million worth of military equipment from the USSR, Eastern Europe, and Cuba. This is including tanks, light aircrafts, helicopters, heavy artillery, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft weapons, hundreds of military transport vehicles, as well as tons of small arms and ammunition. Cuba is presently using Nicaraguan territory to provide training and other facilities to guerrillas active in neighboring countries. The Cuban ambassador to Nicaragua and other American department officials frequently meet with Central American guerrillas in Managua to advise them on tactics and strategy. Individual Sandinista leaders have participated in such meetings and have met independently with Guatemalan and Salvadorian insurgents. So what we're seeing, ladies and gentlemen, here right off the bat is more narco-terrorism. Cuba is, with the help of the USSR here, is providing essentially military-grade resources to the various political factions and ruling parties in Nicaragua, particularly the ones in power, so that they can better protect drug shipments and arms shipments to various other countries. And I mean, that's just pretty much the long and short of it, ladies and gentlemen. It's just simply narco-terrorism. I mean, it's not, these are not standing armies here that we're talking about. Okay, these are not armies that could withstand an assault or an invasion from a foreign power. Okay, these are guerrilla fighters that are proficient in urban warfare tactics, asymmetrical warfare, and guerrilla warfare. These persons are essentially there to protect cocaine boats and so forth, and protect the ruling classes of Nicaragua, particularly the politicians that fund their programs, and very little else, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, when you talk about this narco-terrorist activity that we've been discussing over the past couple of days now, you'll notice that the USSR is mentioned multiple times. The USSR has an interest in Cuba because the USSR gave Cuba communism, a communist philosophy, and took an interest in Cuba as a strategic ally because of its proximity to the United States. Now, the USSR has certainly acted as a parental figure to the Cuban state with respect to keeping it afloat, keeping it economically stable, keeping it politically stable, and keeping it stable militarily, and also kind of using Cuba as a proxy for further insurgent and narco-terroristic activity throughout South America. But the USSR is not the one getting its hands dirty per se, but it's providing funding for the Cuban government to sort of manipulate various South American countries with respect to setting up regimes, getting its various import and export commerce mechanisms going strong, stabilizing its governmental mechanism, trying to quell civil wars and coups d'etats, and essentially creating a communist alliance throughout South America for strategic reasons. All right, we're going to move on to El Salvador. Before 1979, Cuban support to Salvadorian radicals involved training small numbers of guerrillas, providing modest financial aid, and serving as a political conduit between Salvadorian extremists and communists outside the hemisphere. During the Nicaraguan Civil War, Cuba concentrated on support for the FSLN. After the fall of Somoza, Cuba began intense efforts to help pro-Cuban guerrillas to come to power in El Salvador. When reform-minded civil-military governments emerged, they were established in October 1979, and Cuba's first priority was to tighten the political organization and unity of El Salvador's fragmented, violent left. At first, arms shipments and other aid from Cuba were kept low as the Cubans insisted on unified strategy as the price of increased material support. To forge unity, Cuba sponsored a December 1979 meeting in Havana that resulted in an initial unity agreement among the Armed Forces of National Resistance, which is FARN, the Popular Liberation Forces, which is the FPL, and the Communist Party of El Salvador, which is PCES, which has itself formed an armed wing in Cuba and with Soviet insistence. In late May 1980, after more negotiations in Havana, the Popular Revolutionary Army, ERP, was admitted into the guerrilla coalition. This new combined military command assumed the name the United Revolutionary Directorate, or the DRU. During this period, Cuba also coordinated the development of clandestine support networks in Honduras, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua, sometimes using arms supply mechanisms established during the Nicaraguan Civil War. With unified tactics and operations now possible, Cuba began to assist the guerrillas in forming military strategy. Cuban specialists helped the DRU devise initial war plans in the summer of 1980. The Cubans influenced the guerrillas to launch a general offensive in 1981. After the offensive failed, guerrilla leaders traveled to Havana in 1981 to finalize All right, I guess that's the end of the... Hold on one second, ladies and gentlemen. To finalize a strategy to improve our initial military situation by engaging in a negotiating maneuver to gain time to regroup. Cuba provided few weapons and ammunition to the Salvadoran guerrillas from its own resources, but played a key role in coordinating the acquisition and delivery of arms from Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Eastern Europe through Nicaragua. After the unmasking of the network, Cuba and Nicaragua reduced the flow in March and early April. Prior to a guerrilla offensive in August, an upswing in deliveries occurred. The arms flow continues via clandestine surface and air routes. In addition, the Cubans over the past year have established a network of small ships to deliver arms to Salvadoran insurgent groups. Now, what you'll notice here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the activity that the USSR has commissioned Cuba to undertake in the El Salvadorian state is identical to Costa Rica, Colombia, Nicaragua, all of them. I mean, it is almost identical in each state, ladies and gentlemen. Now, keep something in mind here. These are strategic interests for the USSR of these times, okay? The USSR is fully aware during these matters, these political shifts, that the CIA has had extensive operations in South America up to this point in setting up puppet regimes, essentially. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing a demand from the Hispanic or from the Spanish-speaking world. They want the CIA, the American CIA, they want them out. And they want the USSR to come in. Okay, they want the CIA out, and they want Moscow in, and they want Cuba in, because Cuba is sort of the well, we'll say the driving force that the USSR has crafted as its mouthpiece to the Latino world. So here's why the Spanish-speaking countries that are named here want the CIA out and they want the Russians to come in. It's because, first and foremost, the American CIA is an auxiliary of the Department of Defense, or I'm sorry, the Department of Justice, right? So the Department of Justice is an auxiliary of the United States federal government. The United States federal government is crafted on capitalist ideals, okay? At this time in history, the Spanish-speaking world is not interested in capitalism, okay? The Spanish-speaking world resents capitalism because it associates capitalism with imperialism. It associates capitalism with invasions. It associates capitalism with occupations and puppet regimes, okay, against the will of the Latino-speaking world, ladies and gentlemen. The Spanish-speaking populations, the Spanish-speaking military governments, the Spanish-speaking insurgent forces, and indeed the Spanish-speaking governments of South America and Central America and the Caribbean, for that matter, prefer communism, okay? And here's why. It's because when the USSR gave communism to Cuba, right, and showed Cuba how to manipulate a communist destiny for itself, they saw a dynamic shift in Cuba. They saw Cuba as less of a victim and less of a piece of prey for imperial powers. Okay? Russia gave Cuba, when it handed it communism and it started doing arms deals and big business in Cuba, it gave Cuba a dynamic of self-sufficiency that it didn't have before. Yeah, Russia's in charge now, and Russia is behind the scenes. But Cuba had more of a sense of internal security with the Russians in charge, as opposed to when the CIA was in charge with the Bautista regime. So what I think happened was there was a dynamic where after the Soviet Union gave Cuba communism, and Cuba started influencing other Latino countries in the South American and Central American regions to embrace communism for self-empowerment. I believe that those things sort of spread about as the new trend, and governments around the Spanish-speaking world started embracing communism and rejecting capitalism, and sort of embracing communist ideals and embracing communist political philosophies. And furthermore, I think that the Spanish-speaking world saw the USSR as an asset, okay? Because the USSR has always been one of the world's richest and most powerful countries. And furthermore, the USSR and China in these times had a strong alliance as two major and powerful communistic entities that opposed Western imperialism in Latino or Spanish-speaking countries. And I think that was a major driving factor. The USSR had less of an imperialist posture with the Latinos. Okay, it was more about connecting with the Spanish-speaking world under the banner of communism than it was about infiltrating these Spanish-speaking countries, asserting your power over them, setting up puppet regimes, and essentially sitting on top of a throne as the master of the Spanish-speaking world. That's what the United States was doing. That's what the CIA was doing. And I think that when you look at the revolutions that Fidel Castro and Che Guevara participated in, it was anti-U.S. imperialism. The USSR, on the other hand, was equally as powerful as the United States militarily, at least. Okay, it wasn't quite as powerful as the United States financially or economically, but militarily, the USSR was at least on par with the United States. And they had more of an interest with sort of proselytizing the gospel of communism to the Spanish-speaking world rather than essentially ruling over them with a whip in one hand and a rifle in the other, as the United States was doing to them for several decades. So it was just a preference. I mean, the Spanish-speaking world just typically preferred the USSR influences, USSR or Soviet Russian influences over American influences. So when Soviet Russia commissioned Cuba to go into the Spanish-speaking countries and sort of help them to arm themselves militarily, of course there was a financial aspect to this. I mean, arms deals are big business. I mean, if there were, for example, Mikhail Kalashnikov, who designed the Avtomat Kalashnikov Model 47 rifles, also known as the AK-47, right? Those were being manufactured in Russia, and a lot of those were being sold to Nicaraguan and Costa Rican and El Salvadorian and other Spanish-speaking governments at a premium, and that was bringing in vast swaths of financial resources to Russia. But also other Russian arms and ammunitions that were produced were also sold to Spanish-speaking governments to assist these guerrilla insurgencies in arming themselves and protecting various interests. I mean, there was the drug trade, there were vegetables and crops, there was the brothel industry, there was the protection of Cuban officials, there were paramilitary operations, there were military operations, and there were police operations that all drew empowerment and resources from the USSR at a premium. Okay, the USSR was definitely getting something in return, but it was supplying these Spanish-speaking countries with communism, which was a stabilizing force, okay, that eliminated all of the coups d'etats and civil wars that were going on in the Latino world at the time. And it also supplied arms, police training, and military training for these countries as well, with Cuba as its mouthpiece or as its spokesperson. It was definitely a business from day one. So we're going to look at Guatemala, ladies and gentlemen. Castro has stepped up Cuba's support to Guatemalan guerrillas, whom he has aided with arms and training since he came to power. And elsewhere, Cuba has influenced divided extremist groups to unite and has conditioned increased Cuban aid on a commitment to armed struggle and a unified strategy. During 1980, discussions about a unity agreement were held among leaders of the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, which is the EGP, the Rebel Armed Forces, which is the FAR, the Organization of People in Arms, ORPA, and the dissident faction of the Guatemalan Communist Party, PGT/D. At the invitation of Sandinista leaders, representatives of the four groups met in Managua under strict security to continue discussions. In November 1980, four organizations signed a unity agreement in Managua to establish the National Revolutionary Union, with Manuel Pinheiro Losada, chief of the America Department, and Ramiro Jesus Abroy Quintana, head of the Central American Division, represented Fidel Castro at the signing ceremony. Following the signing of the unity agreement, representatives of the CGR traveled to Havana to present the document to Castro. ORPA publicized the agreement and a communique issued November 18, 1980. All parties agreed it was significant, and the unity agreement was the first such document signed on Central American soil. So what we see, ladies and gentlemen, is we see the USSR directing the Cuban regime to introduce unity agreements throughout the various rival political parties of Guatemala. These are political parties that resolve their issues typically with machine gun fire and improvised explosive devices. And that is no good at this point. What the USSR is doing is it wants to stabilize it wants to stabilize Central, South America, and the Caribbean islands so that it can establish a diplomatic relationship with these countries, okay, so as to form an international communist alliance, you see. At the time, there were a few communist countries that were in operation throughout the world, but Russia wanted even more, and it saw the CIA's disruptive elements as a strategic advantage for the USSR to move in, stabilize these groups, have them sign peace treaties, or have these political parties sign peace treaties with each other, make them more diplomatic, okay, and establish a communistic endeavor, which certainly favored the USSR and its allies at the time. All right. Let's see. So we're gonna read here. Costa Rican pilots who made these flights to. There was a special legislative commission established in June 1980 by the Costa Rican legislature. It revealed Cuba's role in arming the Nicaraguan guerrilla fighter. Now, this was to establish a political elite in Nicaragua. I mean, they can't all be ruling parties, okay? So it's Cuba has stepped in and decided to arm the ruling political factions in Nicaragua, so that there can be a ruling party, and then there are several opposition parties that can compete for the vote of the people. And essentially, they were essentially arming Costa Rica. They were arming Nicaragua, and they were giving them 1 million pounds of arms, including anti-aircraft machine guns, rocket launchers, bazookas, and mortars. So they were essentially getting these weapons from the USSR and supplying them to various South American governments, particularly the FSLN here in Costa Rica, so that they can they can establish some sort of a power structure. Okay. There were terrorist actions in Costa Rica in 1981, scattered incidents, and it looks like we're kind of pivoting off of El Salvador here and moving into Costa Rican influences. All right. Because they're all interconnected. I mean, the Cuban influence in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica, all right, Panama, Colombia, I mean, all of them. They were all interconnected, and they were all armed and stabilized in similar ways so as to make this alliance stronger. There was uniformity in these countries now that Cuba had begun arming certain political factions that the USSR saw as the preferential political factions in those countries. But there was terrorism in Costa Rica. There were insurgents that were apparently blowing up vehicles that contained Costa Rican chauffeurs and Marine security guards from the U.S. Embassy. So they were basically blowing up vehicles that contained U.S. Marines as a show of anti-American sentiment. Four terrorists were captured machine gunning a police vehicle. In June, the group murdered 3 policemen and a taxi driver in Costa Rica. There were 20 accused terrorists that were arrested, and they were linked to the South American terrorist groups like the Argentine Montoneros, the Uruguayan Tupamaros, and Colombia's M19, and to Cuba itself. So these terrorist actions were facilitated by Cuba, ladies and gentlemen. And this is important because keep something in mind. This happened 44 years ago, okay? Cuba has progressed diplomatically since then, but we have to keep something in mind. It has still found itself on the state sponsor of terrorism list. That means some of these old habits have not fully been extinguished in the Cuban governmental system of operations. And I think it's important to highlight these things as we move on into new political socioeconomic matters between Cuba and the Western world. So we got Honduras. Cuba provided paramilitary training to a small number of Hondurans in the 1960s, but it still had problems with Honduran radicals. Okay, there were Honduran radical groups that didn't want Cuba to take over in Honduras. These Cuban radicals wanted to establish themselves as the rulers of Honduras. But keep something in mind, Cuba is being backed by the USSR, which is vastly more powerful than Honduras. And there was very little, the resistance was ultimately futile. Cuba resumed military trainings for members of the Honduran Communist Party and integrated them into the Internationalist Brigade fighting in the Nicaraguan Civil War. After the war, PCH members returned to Cuba for additional training. Now, I mean, you'll see again, Cuba is establishing, with the help of the USSR, communist factions in the South American region. Okay, Cuba is arming and training the Honduran Communist Party, which is eventually going to become another ally of the USSR. You see, the USSR is gaining allies throughout South America and the Caribbean islands strategically. This is a strategic takeover by the USSR. It's strategic. You see, they're not looking to impose their will. And mind you, not everything I say about the United States is going to be derogatory. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, but you're going to have to keep something in mind. You're talking, or you're listening to, rather, a targeted individual. Okay, I'm a man who has experienced disruption in my own personal life that mirrors the kinds of disruptions that a lot of the South American and Central American countries experienced at the hands of the CIA. The CIA, I mean, maybe it's cleaned its act up over the years, but in 1981, it was certainly an actor in setting up puppet regimes and carrying out disruption campaigns in the Middle East and in South America. And apparently the Middle East and South America during these times, particularly 1979 through 1981, got tired of CIA interference in its political affairs, and they started sort of embracing the USSR's communistic political philosophy in place of that, because it felt like it was gaining a partner in the USSR and in Cuba, which was the USSR's mouthpiece. It felt like the South American and Central American countries felt like they were gaining an ally as opposed to a master, which is what the CIA acted as in South American and Middle Eastern countries in these times. So Cuba is developing Honduras as a conduit for arms and other aids to guerrilla active elsewhere in Central America. Now, keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen. These armed insurgencies that Cuba is financing, that the USSR is selecting, okay, these are political parties as well. These people are acting on behalf of political parties, okay? So it's about establishing numero unos, okay, top dogs in the South American, Central American, and Caribbean regions. These top dogs, these top political parties are being established right now with the guidance of the USSR and the actions of Cuba, you see. And these political parties are being armed. They're being trained as military factions, and they are being placed in seats of power and seats of communist influence by the USSR and Cuba. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move back over to the Caribbean. We're going to look at Jamaica. In the 1970s, Jamaica became a special target for Cuba. Fidel Castro and other Cuban officials developed close relationships with important members of the People's National Parties, which governed Jamaica from 1973 to 1980. Cuban security personnel trained Jamaican security officers in Cuba and Jamaica, including members of the security force of the Office of the Prime Minister. Cuba also trained about 1,400 Jamaican youths in Cuba as construction workers through a brigadista program. Political indoctrination in Cuba formed part of its group's curriculum. A considerable number of these Jamaican youths received military training while in Cuba, including instruction in revolutionary tactics and the use of arms. During this same period, the Cuban diplomatic mission in Jamaica grew. We're going to scroll down. Cuba was instrumental in smuggling arms and ammunition into Jamaica. A Cuban front corporation, Munex International, was registered in Liechtenstein, which I'm almost positive is in the Czech Republic. It might be Germany though. With subsidiaries in Panama and Jamaica. Was discovered in 1980 to be the designated recipient of a shipment of 200,000 shotgun shells and 38 caliber pistol ammunitions shipped illegally to Jamaica from Miami. Jamaican authorities apprehended the local manager of the corporation, accompanied by the Jamaican Minister of National Security and Cuban Ambassador Estrada, as the manager was attempting to leave the country in defiance of police instructions on a private plane. The manager subsequently paid a fine of $300,000 set by a Jamaican court. In 1980, weapons were reported stockpiled in the Cuban embassies for possible use by Jamaicans during the election campaign. M16 rifles then appeared in Jamaica for the first time and were used in attacks against supporters of the opposition Jamaican Labour Party and the security forces. Over 70 of these weapons have been found by the Jamaican authorities. Some of the M16s in Jamaica have serial numbers in the same numerical series as the captured M16s shipped to Salvadorian guerrillas from Vietnam. Ambassador Ulysses Estrada was withdrawn from his post in November 1980 at the request of the newly elected JLP government. I'm going to scroll down. The government decided to maintain diplomatic ties but warned Cuba to stop its interference in Jamaican affairs. Cuba continued to maintain some 15 intelligence agencies in the Cuban embassy in Kingston. On October 29th, the government broke diplomatic ties with Cuba, citing Cuba's failure to return 3 Jamaican fugitive criminals as the immediate cause for this action. On November 17th, the government publicly detailed Cuba's role in providing covert military training under the curtailed Brigadista program. So this is interesting, what happened between Jamaica and Cuba. So Cuba started off in Jamaica the same way it started off in so many Central and South American countries. It armed political parties that the USSR wanted to see succeed. It trained people. It trained youths. It probably tried at some point to introduce communism into Jamaica. But we have to keep something in mind too, that Jamaica is it's a it's sort of a territory of the United Kingdom, right? I mean, Jamaica is one of the countries that the United Kingdom's monarchy is considered to be the king of. So keep something in mind, that the Jamaican that England, or rather the United Kingdom, is an ally of the United States. Okay, Cuba was not going to invade Jamaica. Well, not necessarily invade, but Cuba was not getting ready to essentially control or be the catalyst for political change in Jamaica. Okay, because Jamaica is indirectly tied to the United States through England. And the United States or England, neither country was willing to allow any kind of a political coup d'etat in Jamaica by Cuba, because, I mean, quite frankly, it just didn't need to take that loss. I mean, so Jamaican authorities were very hands-on with Cuba, and they didn't really allow Cuba to spread its influence there the way it did in places like Nicaragua or Costa Rica or El Salvador or Honduras. The Jamaican authorities, which were very intimately directed by Great Britain, put a stop to Cuba's influence, or the spreading of its influence in the early 1980s. Jamaican affairs are more the business of Great Britain and the United States than it is of Cuba and the USSR. And the Jamaican authorities made quite a few arrests. I mean, you see here, they arrested the Cuban ambassador Estrada, who was trying to leave the country in defiance of police instructions. I mean, Estrada was one of the key middlemen between Jamaica, Cuba, and Soviet Russia, with respect to the arming of political parties and the spread of Cuban influence in Jamaica. And not only that, but the manager had to pay $300,000 US in a Jamaican court. That ought to tell you right then and there who was in charge there. Okay, it is not Cuba or the USSR, it's Great Britain and by proxy the United States, who obviously assisted in that conflict. And what it looked like that the Cuban embassy had secured machine guns that were manufactured in Vietnam and essentially gave them to the ruling political party in Jamaica so that it could basically gun down the opposition party, okay, which was the Jamaican Labor Party. And keep something in mind, in these countries, which at the time were considered third world countries by Western standards, a lot of political elections were decided by who had the most firepower. And essentially there were M16 rifles that were given to the ruling political party in Jamaica, and they used those M16s to essentially annihilate the Jamaican Labor Party through warfare and intimidation, so that the Jamaican Labor Party would not be able to take over in Jamaica. So eventually Cuba defaulted on an agreement to release 3 Jamaican fugitives from custody. And Jamaica, possibly at the direction of Great Britain, who, keep in mind, had amassed, up until probably about 100 years before this event, the largest empire in human history. I mean, Great Britain at this time was still considered a world power and was only 40 years removed from the World War II victory. So, given Great Britain's proximity to the United States and its financial influence over Jamaica at this particular time, chances are that these socio-political matters were being decided behind the scenes by Great Britain and the United States. So ultimately, Cuba's influence got completely eradicated from Jamaica because Jamaica was felt slighted at Cuba's refusal to release 3 Jamaican fugitives that were caught and supposed to be released but never did. So we're going to move on to Guyana. In 1978, as many as 200 Cuban technicians, advisors, and medical personnel were stationed in Guyana. However, while claiming fraternal relationship with Guyana's government, Cuba maintained contact with radical opposition groups. Guyanese authorities suspected the Cubans of involvement in a crippling sugar strike. In August 1978, five Cuban diplomats were expelled for involvement in illegal activities. Cuban military advisors have provided guerrilla training outside Guyana to members of a small radical Guyanese opposition group, the Working People's Alliance. 5 of 7 members of the Cuban embassy are known or suspected intelligence agents. So the section on Guyana is short and brief. Guyana didn't quite trust Cuba. Cuba had limited operations in Guyana. At the time, one of Cuba's major exports was sugar. And I believe that it's possible that Cuba's success in the sugar industry gave it authority in the region, and they probably manipulated the price of sugar to force the Guyanese government to rely on Cuba for those economic matters, and I think Guyana took exception to that and limited its cooperation with Cuba. Let's see. All right, we're going to move on to Grenada. Cuban influence in Grenada mushroomed almost immediately after March 1979 during a coup d'etat led by the New Jewel movement of Maurice Bishop. Bishop and his closest colleagues were Western-educated Marxist radicals, and they turned for help to Fidel Castro, who proved willing to provide assistance. To allow close Cuban supervision of Grenadian programs, senior intelligence officers from the America Department, Julian Torres Rizzo, was sent to Grenada as an ambassador. Torres Rizzo maintained intimate relationships with Bishop and other People's Revolutionary Government ministers, such as Bernard Cord. The Grenadian government has followed a pro-Soviet foreign policy line. Cuban and Grenadian voting records and international organizations have been nearly identical, so much so that they were alone of all Western Hemisphere nations that have voted against UN resolutions condemning Soviet invasions of Afghanistan. So I think I could stop right there on Grenada. I mean, essentially, Grenada was one of those countries that both wanted and needed the Cuban portfolio of political products, which consisted of communistic political philosophies and the armament of political parties that were most receptive to those communist political philosophies. And apparently Grenada became essentially a student of Marxist communism and became a strategic ally of the USSR. And they found a way to vote against UN resolutions condemning the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a hot political topic in the 1980s, and it goes to show that Grenada was very much pro-Soviet and very much they were pro-Cuba as well, because Cuba was sort of the mouthpiece. Well, not sort of the mouthpiece, they were the mouthpiece and sort of the general secretary of the Soviet Union in these times. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, it is natural for powerful countries like the Soviet Union to indoctrinate or recruit, or rather convert, less powerful countries into alliances that are supposed to serve both the Soviet Union and these South American, Central American, and Caribbean countries. It wasn't a one-sided affair. these were mutually beneficial relationships between the Soviet Union and these South American, Central American, and Caribbean countries. We're going to move on to the Dominican Republic, and this video will exceed the 1 hour mark. With its renewed commitment to armed struggle, Cuba's interest in the Dominican Republic has revived. Since the early 1980s, the Cubans have been encouraging radicals in the Dominican Republic to unite and prepare for armed actions. Cuban intelligence officials like Omar Corboda Rivas, chief of the Dominican Republic Desk of the America Department, make periodic visits to the islands. The Soviet Union, Cuba, and other communist countries have mounted extensive training programs for Dominican students. In 1981, the Moscow-aligned Dominican Communist Party for the first time publicized the Soviet scholarship program. Some 700 Dominican students are currently studying at Soviet universities, principally Patrice Lumumba University, with another 75 in 5 other communist states: Bulgaria, Cuba, and the German Democratic Republic, Hungary, and Romania. The PCD itself selects more than 100 students who begin the Soviet program each year. Within the Dominican Republic, we see a continuation of the trend of Soviet and other communist countries. It's possible that China had an influence. It's possible that Vietnam had an influence in arming and educating the Dominican Republic, Dominican Communist Party, with the expectation of creating strategic allies in the region. I mean, keep something in mind, ladies and gentlemen. You're talking about Russia, you're talking about China, you're talking about Vietnam, okay? In particular, during these times, these countries have mastered the communist political, governmental, and socioeconomic mechanism. And they are looking to maintain alliances in the Spanish-speaking world so as to have a strategic ally in those regions. And keep something in mind, too, that with respect to these matters in today's world, I've said it plenty of times before, ladies and gentlemen, okay? And obviously these are relationships that have endured through the ages. I've always said that if Russia, China, Vietnam, Iran, North Korea, and various other communist countries are still assisting Cuba in stabilizing itself and helping its citizens get by day to day with various financial products and so forth, then that's only natural. It's benevolent. Okay, Russia, China, the rest of them, I think they should be applauded for giving a helping hand to the Cuban state and its people in Cuba and in the United States, Miami. But, okay, when you factor in clandestine gang stalking, ladies and gentlemen, it creates a bit of a dilemma because, first of all, and this is just the truth of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to tell half-truths. We're here to be accurate, okay, in our assertions. So it's obvious to me that there are a number of stabilization mechanisms that are used, okay, by the Cuban government, possibly in concert with other communist countries, to stabilize the Cuban population here. And I think one of those products, unbeknownst to Russia and China, is clandestine gang stalking. Okay? Now, it's difficult to know, okay, outside of its origins in the United States Departments of Defense and Justice. What other countries have detailed information on clandestine gang stalking? But one thing I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, without a shadow of a doubt, okay, the Cuban population here in Miami-Dade County is protected by forces outside of the Cuban community here. Okay, the Cuban community here is following the directives of somebody somewhere in order to keep itself safe and in order to keep its communities homogenous. Now, if those actors include Russia, China, and North Korea, and they inadvertently supported clandestine gang stalking as one of the many products that are used to protect and stabilize the Cuban population here in Miami, I am not going to get upset at that. Here's where gang stalking angers me, okay? It angers me from this perspective. My liaisons, my handlers, those that have manipulated, controlled, and facilitated my gang stalking campaign over the past 30 years have tapped into the inner workings of a community of people who speak a language that I don't speak and have been in this country for far fewer generations than black African people. I don't want to be targeted at all by people who have been in this country for fewer generations than my ancestors. Okay, at all. And that's a huge part of my angst and my disillusionment with having experienced clandestine gang stalking here in South Florida. Now, I'm going to say this, ladies and gentlemen, clandestine gang stalking is an American product. It was started here. It was cultivated here. It's financed by the American taxpayer, and it is implemented using American DOD and DOJ actors. Okay? Now, here's what I'm going to say, ladies and gentlemen. I'm of the mindset that Russia, China, and North Korea, Iran, Vietnam, a lot of the communist countries that I've had an opportunity to speak on have an opinion of the gang stalking product. I think they have an opinion of the gang stalking conundrum, and I think they have an opinion of Cuban sovereignty. Okay? I think these countries know without a shadow of a doubt that if they were to withdraw their support from the Cuban state in particular, as well as some of the other South American and Caribbean countries that have built upon and drawn political stability from communist support, I think they know that Cuba would face challenges. And Cuba has been a staunch ally of the communist world for 60 years now. And I just don't think that Russia, China, and the rest of them want to see Cuba fail. So I think that there are mechanisms and protocols that may have been introduced to the Cuban American population here in Miami, possibly by the U.S. and possibly by foreign actors, that enable them to do things like clandestine gang stalking. Now, that's not for me to sit here and say that I think that gang stalking goes on in China or Russia or North Korea or Iran or Vietnam or any communist country or any other country in the world. I have not traveled to any other country in the world at length, so I can't really comment on whether or not there's gang stalking in other countries. But I do believe that these various other countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Vietnam, beautiful countries, gorgeous countries, wonderfully managed countries, countries with amazing histories and amazing cultures, okay? I believe that these countries have taken on sort of a big brother role in the Cuban trajectory through history, and they see Cuba as a younger brother or a younger sibling, and they have a protective influence and a protective interest in Cuba, as well as a strategic and political interest in Cuba. And I think that in supporting Cuba, that these countries may have inadvertently, without knowing, allowed Cuban Americans to gain access to American programs like clandestine gang stalking and use them to keep their communities homogenous. Okay, me personally, I experience gang stalking in homogenous communities that are typically Cuban dominated, and it's obvious that they're using these harassment techniques to keep non-Cubans or non-Spanish speaking persons like me out of their communities. Okay, Cubans enjoy homogenous communities, institutions, and facilities. They like all Cuban establishments here, and I think they have tapped in to programs like clandestine gang stalking to assert themselves and to protect their communities from outsiders. Now, I'm going to say this too, ladies and gentlemen. One thing that has always agitated me about the Cuban American population here in Miami is that a lot of the ones that really practice clandestine gang stalking in what you might call large quantities of it, they're carrying themselves like they created the program, like this is. We created gang stalking. We execute gang stalking. Look at how organized and look at how well structured we are with all the synchronization and espionage tactics that they use. This is not a Cuban product at all. Okay, the Cuban American population here was plugged into gang stalking by the Departments of Defense and Justice. And it kind of creates an interesting dynamic because the Departments of Defense and the Department of Justice appear to have as much of an interest in Cuban American sovereignty in Miami-Dade County as Cuba's various allies do. So it's possible you have the Departments of Defense and Justice along with Russia, China, Vietnam, etc., all of which are combined in their desire to see the Cuban American population in Miami-Dade County as sovereign. Okay, the U.S. federal government obviously sees the Cuban American population here as an asset. Okay, just like I'm starting to believe that the U.S. federal establishment sees illegal immigrants to this country from Mexico and Cuba as assets. Okay, it's difficult to see why. It's difficult to understand why. I think it's because they are homogenous. They like homogenous communities, and they tend to shy away from and discourage non-Hispanics from entering their communities, facilities, and institutions. I think there's something about that segregationist mindset that the United States finds endearing. Okay, keep in mind, there was a time in America's history where it was little more than a giant plantation. Okay, for 400 years of its history, the United States wasn't nothing but a giant plantation. And then after slavery ended, it became a hub for segregation and a hub for domestic terrorism against freedmen and their supporters. And I think that there's still sort of a desire for the good old days that I think that the United States federal establishment draws from the Cuban and Mexican communities here in the United States. They are very segregationist. Just like America was at some point. And I think the U.S. federal establishment sees that as an asset because there are elements of the U.S. federal government that wants to go back to segregation. Okay, before the civil rights movement, that era, there are elements of the U.S. federal government that want to go back to those days, and that's part of what clandestine gang stalking does. It gives people who want homogenous communities, even if it's, I mean, it could be black, it could be Haitian, it could be Jamaican, it could be Cuban, it could be Mexican, it could be the Russian community, it could be a Korean part of town, it could be the Arab community, it could be the Filipino community, it could be the Lithuanian community in America. What gang stalking allows various communities to do is it gives them clandestine operations and clandestine signaling mechanisms and clandestine protocols that it can use in conjunction with the DOD and the DOJ to get rid of people. I mean, it's easy to target people and put people in a gang stalking campaign throughout the United States, like myself, but you can also use these mechanisms to get rid of outsiders. So, I mean, let's say I have a Romanian community somewhere in Cleveland who doesn't want blacks or Puerto Ricans in that community. You can tap into clandestine resources that are reminiscent of clandestine gang stalking and use those clandestine operations to discourage people from these ethnic groups from coming to your city, from coming to your town, from moving into your neighborhoods, from sending their kids to your schools. You can unleash these clandestine harassment techniques, okay, which are provided by the Departments of Defense and Justice, all right, through undercover operatives and liaisons to keep your communities homogenous. So in addition to allowing persons who have allegedly transgressed against people in their life, allowing their enemies to tap into gang stalking to exact revenge against these people, it's not just that. It's not just about human experimentation. It's not just about human behavior modification. It's not just about getting revenge on people you think have wronged you in the past. Clandestine gang stalking can be tapped into by entire communities to keep those communities homogenous and to keep outsiders out of your communities. You see, so gang stalking is also a tool that various communities can use to encourage segregation. You see, and I believe that the Spanish-speaking populations of the United States have tapped into it to keep non-Spanish-speaking people out of their communities and out of their facilities. Okay? So when you're talking about something like this, where you're looking at the Dominican Republic, all right, you got the Soviet Union arming Cuba and other communist countries, the Dominican Republic, its Dominican Communist Party. It's teaching its students. It's established a communist-styled university so that it can create a communistic element in the Dominican Republic, so as to sort of keep the communistic political philosophy as the dominant political philosophy of the Dominican Republic, so as to keep a strategic ally in the region for Soviet Russia, China, and other communist world powers that desire these strategic alliances in the Spanish-speaking world. So, for example, if you are a member of the Dominican Communist Party, right? Your family, your offspring, your colleagues, okay, and anyone that subscribes to the communistic political philosophy in the Dominican Republic, and anyone who identifies with the Dominican Communist Party is going to be set aside. Okay, they're going to have resources at their disposal to keep opposition parties away from them. Okay, so that the dominant political party is the Communist political party, and that's the political party that will flourish. and that's the political party that will thrive. And the members of that political party are going to have protective resources at their disposal to keep away non-communists and segregate themselves from non-communists, you see. So we're going to look at Colombia, and then we're going to move on to Argentina, and then we're going to look at the postscript. Colombia, Argentina, and Uruguay. Then we're going to look at the postscript and close the lecture. So, in Colombia, since the 1960s, Cuba has nurtured contacts with violent extremist groups in democratic Colombia. During the 1970s, Cuba established full diplomatic relations with Colombia. Cuban involvement with Colombian revolutionaries was fairly limited. Although Cuba provided some training to guerrilla leadership, many leaders of the April 19th movement, also known as M19, including the founder Jaime Bateman, who also attended a communist cadre school in Moscow, were trained in Cuba. Leaders of the National Liberation Army, or the ELN, and the Moscow-oriented Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, also received Cuban instruction. Cuban assistance to Colombian guerrillas was stepped up after the February 1980 seizure of the Dominican Republic embassy in Bogota. A number of diplomats, including the U.S. ambassador, were taken hostage by M19 terrorists. As a part of a negotiated settlement, the terrorists were flown on April 17, 1980 to Cuba, where the remaining hostages were released and the terrorists were given asylum. We're going to move down a little bit. All right, during the mid-1980s, Cuban intelligence officers arranged a meeting of Colombian extremists, attended by representatives from the M19, FARC, ELN, and other Colombian radical groups, to discuss a common strategy and tactics. We're going to scroll down. In late 1980, the M19 set into motion a large-scale operation in Colombia with Cuban help. So what we're seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is we're seeing a sort of a rehash of Cuban activity in the area. Cuba has always been a strategic region for Cuba, not just for a strategic alliance, but because Colombia is the world's number one grower and supplier of cocaine, which was was actually a significant part of the Cuban economy in this time period. Fidel Castro actually purchased tons and untold tons, several hundreds of tons of cocaine from the Colombian government, all of which was protected by Colombian insurgents. And this cocaine was packaged. It was bought from the Colombian establishment. It was packaged it was purchased and packaged in Colombia. It was shipped to Cuba, and then it was brought to Miami, which it sold like peppermint patties here in the United States, and still does actually. So, the narco-terrorism that Cuba facilitated in Colombia was not just about arming insurgent groups and converting the Colombian political populace to communism, as it had done in so many other countries. I mean, what we're seeing here is we're seeing sort of a Roman Empire styled political takeover of the Latin America, of the South American, Central American, the whole Spanish speaking world. And it's spearheaded by the USSR, which for all intents and purposes was the Roman Empire of the day, ladies and gentlemen. And China was right there with the Soviet Union assisting this political takeover with respect to converting numerous Spanish-speaking countries to communism and arming insurgents, particularly those associated with the communistic political groups, for protection. But when Cuba went down into Colombia, I mean, Cuba obviously already had some sort of a drug trafficking relationship with Colombia. But when Cuba started becoming intimate with Colombia politically, it saw the vast horizon. Okay, it saw the vast economic benefits. It saw the vast opportunities that the cocaine business had to offer. Okay, so as it was arming insurgents, as it was setting up political parties, as it was setting up communism, it was also setting up drug cartels. And they were packaging up this cocaine by the tons, and it was ending up on the Florida Keys, and US dollars, billions of it, coming directly from the US taxpayer, who was the primary purchaser of it, was going back to Cuba and further financing its activities in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to skip down a little bit. All right, so Cuba's propaganda support for Colombian terrorists was impossible to deny. When a group apparently consisting of M19 dissidents kidnapped an American working for private religious institutes, Cuba implicitly supported the terrorist actions through Radio Havana broadcast beamed to Colombia in February 1981, which denounced the institute workers as U.S. spies. Radio Moscow picked up the unfounded accusation to use in its Spanish broadcast to Latin America. The American was later murdered by the kidnappers. So what we're seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is we're seeing more terrorist activity that is being aimed at Americans, okay? We saw it in Nicaragua. We saw it in Costa Rica. Now we're seeing it in Colombia, okay? American influences at this period of time were not welcome in the Spanish-speaking world, south of the American border, okay? They had no problem assassinating Americans of any socioeconomic demographic. It didn't matter if they were politicians. It didn't matter if they were tourists. These groups, these guerrilla fighters, these terrorist factions, these political parties wanted to send clear messages to the United States that the U.S. was not in charge here. It wasn't saying, well, Cuba's in charge here. It wasn't saying the USSR is in charge here. It wasn't saying China is in charge here. It's saying you are not in charge here, ladies and gentlemen. However, Colombia suspended relationships in Cuba on March 23rd in view of the clear evidence of Cuba's role in training M19 guerrillas. President Turbay commented in an August 13 New York Times interview, "When we found that Cuba, a country with which we had diplomatic relations, was using those relations to prepare a group of guerrillas to come and fight against the government, it was kind of a Pearl Harbor for us. It was like sending ministers to Washington at the same time you were about to bomb ships in Hawaii. So Colombia sort of it suspended diplomatic relationships with Cuba, but it continued the cocaine relationships with Cuba. Yeah, okay, the Cuban government, it was like, you know what, we don't want Cuban influence here in the United States, okay? Or, you know, we don't want that here because they're financing a terrorist group to overthrow the sitting government. So we're going to suspend all diplomatic ties with Cuba for trying to implement a puppet regime here, but we still want to sell cocaine to you. Okay? So there was still that economic relationship that was mutually beneficial between Colombia and Cuba, but they just didn't want Cuba's diplomatic influence any further. Okay, stay out of our political affairs, but we will continue to send you 10 tons of cocaine a month. Okay, at a cost of $10 billion a shipment. Right? So they wanted to keep those drug connections alive, but they wanted to end governmental relationships with Cuba. All right, we're going to look at Chile. After Allende's fall in 1973, Castro promised Chilean radicals all the aid in Cuba's power to provide. Although Cuban officials maintained regular contact with many Chilean exiles, divisions among the exiles inhibited major operations. The Moscow-aligned Chilean Communist Party, holding the position that the revolutionary change could be accomplished by nonviolent means, was critical of left-wing forces like the Movement of the Revolutionary Left, which Cuba had close relations. Throughout the 1970s, members of the MIR received training in Cuba and in some cases instructed other Latin American revolutionaries. We're going to scroll down. Once training was completed, Cuba helped the terrorists return to Chile, providing false passports and false identification documents. By late 1980, the highly trained MIR terrorists, which were 100 in number, had re-entered Chile, and the MIR had claimed responsibility for a number of bombings and bank robberies. Cuba's official newspaper, the Granma, wrote in February 1981 that the Chilean Revolutionary Resistance Forces had successfully conducted more than 100 armed actions in Chile. By 1979, the PCCH was reevaluating its position in light of events of Nicaragua, where the fragmented Nicaraguan Communist Party emerged from the civil war subservient to the FSLN. I'm going to scroll down. All right, so we're going to summarize the rest of this article, ladies and gentlemen. So this MIR group was Cuba's brainchild, and by proxy the USSR's brainchild, with respect to who it wanted to rule Chile. Okay, Cuba financed, trained, and empowered the MIR. And apparently they just carried out terrorist action after terrorist action after terrorist action in Chile to assert themselves as the new sheriff in town. Okay, essentially establishing itself as the political party of the future through armed terrorist insurgent actions, which was the norm in South America in this particular time period. going to scroll down some more. All right, Moscow showed its approval of the policy changes concerning the new PCCH policy that had been validated for a broad opposition coalition. So we're seeing the emergence of an opposition party. Moscow approved this new opposition party. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, Moscow, okay, the Kremlin, Russia, the Soviet Union, the USSR, okay, was the driving force behind this radical sweeping political change that was happening in the Spanish-speaking world. And it served as a strategic ally to these people. And it was not so much of a bully or a puppet master to the Spanish-speaking world. It was more of a big brother, okay, a strategic ally, a provider, a stabilizer for the South American, Central American, and the Caribbean countries. And the terrorist activities of the MIR have increased, and they are essentially assassinating high-level government officials. So, I mean, this it kind of leaves you on a cliffhanger as to the ultimate destiny of the MIR terrorist group, which had swept through Chile with the backing of Cuba as the dominant political entity in Chile. And obviously communism was established in Chile at this time as well, as a stabilizing force and as a overarching political philosophy. So we're going to move on to Argentina. The Cubans have had a long history of association with, encouragement of, and active backing for terrorism in Argentina. The Cubans were linked to the two groups responsible for unleashing the waves of leftist terrorism that swept Argentina in the early and mid-1970s. The Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army. Cuba backed these organizations with advice on tactics and instructions on recruiting operations, and with training in Cuba and urban and rural guerrilla techniques. During the height of Argentine terrorism, the Cubans used their embassy in Buenos Aires to maintain direct liaisons with Argentine terrorists. The Argentine terrorists were virtually defeated by 1978. In that year, Castro permitted the Montonero national leadership to relocate its headquarters to Cuba. Today, the Montonero top command, its labor organization, and its intelligent operation, among all other units, are all located in Cuba. The Cubans facilitate the travel and communication of Montoneros, supplying them with false documentation and access to Cuban diplomatic pouches. Montoneros has been among the Latin American guerrillas trained in guerrilla warfare over the past year in the Mideast as part of the cooperative effort between Palestinian groups and Cuba. We're going to move down some. All right. With Cuban support, the Montoneros are active outside Cuba. Cuban-trained Montoneros were among the members of the Internationalist Brigade that Cuba supported in Nicaragua in 1979. This connection was highlighted with Montonero leader Mario Firminich attended the first anniversary of the July 1979 victory, wearing the uniform of a Sandinista commander. Montoneros have been active elsewhere as well. Montoneros largely staffed and administered Radio Noticias del Continente, which broadcasts Cuban propaganda to Central and South America from San Jose until it was closed by the Costa Rican government in 1981 after war material was discovered in its installations. So what we're seeing in, let me scroll back some, in Argentina is we see where the Montoneros and the People's Revolutionary Army, which is a political faction, was essentially the dominant faction in Argentina at this time. Similarly to other terrorist factions that were financed by Cuban operations, they essentially took power through forced terroristic activities and murders. They essentially dominated Argentina, and even assisted the Cuban efforts to convert other South American countries to communism and essentially subjugation under Cuban, Soviet, and other communist countries' commands. And apparently the Montoneros have they staffed and administered a radio administration which broadcast Cuban propaganda to Central and South America. And eventually it was closed by the Costa Rican government because it was seen as a potentially hazardous or otherwise militaristic operation. Okay, it wasn't just a news station, it was a military installation. And Costa Rica didn't feel comfortable with a radio administration having control over its political philosophy or over the political philosophy of its citizens if it also had military interests. So it closed its relationship off with Radio Noticias del Continente in 1981. So, I mean, we're seeing a definite trend here. Cuba is going into countries with the assistance of the Soviet government. It's supplying arms, it's supplying resources, it's supplying training to guerrilla fighters that are aligned with political parties that support communism. Those political parties are taking power through armed rebellions, and they are establishing themselves with the assistance of Cuba and Soviet influences as the dominant parties in the region. We're going to move down to Uruguay. We're going to read the postscript and close the lecture, ladies and gentlemen. After the failure of the urban insurgency organized in the early 1970s by the National Liberation Movement, which is the MLN Tupamaros, several hundred Tupamaros went to Cuba. During the mid-1970s, Cuba provided some of them with training in military and terroristic tactics, weapons, and intelligence. Several of those former Tupamaros subsequently assisted Cuba in running intelligence operations in Europe and Latin America. Some participated in the Cuban Organized Internationalist Brigade that fought in the Nicaraguan Civil War. Cuba continues to provide propaganda support for the Tupamaros and the Uruguayan Communist Party. Radio Havana reported on June 30th, 1981, that the leader of the Communist Party of Uruguay attended a ceremony in solidarity with the Uruguayan people's struggle at the headquarters of the Cuban State Committee for Material and Technical Supply in Havana. Pro-Cuban Uruguayan leaders are given red carpet treatment when they visit Havana and are usually received by at least a member of the Cuban Politburo. So it's a fairly short section on Uruguay. They have a communist party that was essentially Cuba was the catalyst for this new communist party, but Cuba, having been powered by the Soviet Union, was the catalyst for the establishment of this communist party in Uruguay. It's called the Uruguayan Communist Party. It was established with the expectation that it would serve as a strategic ally for the USSR in the region. This internationalist brigade that was organized by the USSR-backed Cuban state fought in the Nicaraguan Civil War on behalf of Nicaraguan communist interests, and essentially The Uruguayan government was very much in solidarity with the Cuban state and was by proxy in solidarity with the communist political philosophy and the USSR, which remained a strategic ally to Uruguay and Cuba in the region. Uruguayan leaders were treated very well by the Cuban government. They were treated as celebrities when they arrived to Cuba for this ceremony, which was essentially a diplomatic ceremony highlighting the friendship between Uruguay and Cuba. And the Cuban Politburo, which is essentially the overarching Cuban federal government. And mind you, the Cuban Politburo was modeled after the Soviet Politburo, which was established as the iron rod of Russian communism by Joseph Stalin, who at this point in time in history was deceased. However, the Politburo that Stalin championed, its mechanism was passed down to the Cuban state, and the Cuban state had a Politburo as well. And I think it should be noted that you see a limited terroristic influence here. It isn't like Colombia or Nicaragua or Argentina, where there were heavy terroristic influences that were implemented by Cuba to achieve political superiority under the communist banner. With Uruguay, essentially the Cuban state provided, it says here, some of them with training in military and terroristic tactics, weapons and intelligence, so that they could fight off opposition parties who may try to usurp power from the Tupamaros and the Uruguayan Communist Party. So these trainings and materials were provided to them so that they could fight off opposition parties that were less sympathetic to communistic rule and authority. So that concludes the countries that are discussed here in this document. Section 4 is the postscript, which is the closing sequence. And it reads, Cuba's renewed campaign of violence has had a negative effect on Cuba's relationship with its neighbors. Cuba's policies abroad and its reaction to immigration pressures at home have reversed the trend in Latin America towards the normalization of relations. Although the Castro government has developed close ties to Nicaragua and Grenada, Cuba finds itself increasingly isolated throughout the Americas. Peru nearly broke relations and removed its ambassador in April 1980, when the Cuban government encouraged Cubans to eagerly leave the island to occupy the Peruvian embassy. After more than 10,000 Cubans crowded into the embassy compound, Castro thwarted efforts by concerned governments to develop an orderly departure program and opened the port of Mariel to immigration, also expelling many criminals and mentally ill people, and ultimately allowing more than 125,000 people to leave under sometimes perilous conditions. But Cuba still refuses to issue safe conduct passes to the 14 Cubans who remain cloistered in the Peruvian embassy in Havana today. Cuban neighbors were further shocked when Cuban MiG-21 sank the Bahamian patrol boat Flamingo on May 10, 1980, in an unprovoked attack in Bahamian coastal waters. Subsequently, 4 Bahamian seamen were machine gunned while trying to save themselves after their vessel sank. Their bodies were never recovered. The U.S. Coast Guard aircraft were harassed by Cuban MiGs while searching for survivors at the request of the Bahamian government. Relations between Venezuela and Cuba deteriorated badly in 1980, principally over the asylum issue. to the degree that Venezuela has removed its ambassador from Havana. In November 1980, Jamaica expelled the Cuban ambassador for interference in Jamaica's internal affairs, and in October 1981 broke diplomatic relations. Cuba suspended relations in March 1981 over Cuba's training of M19 guerrillas. Cuba's handling of an incident in which a group of Cubans demanding asylum forcibly occupied Ecuador's embassy in Havana and prompted Ecuador to remove its ambassador from Cuba in May 1981. Also in May, Costa Rica severed its existing consular ties with Cuba, expelling Cuban officials active in coordinating support networks for Central American insurgents. Today, outside of the English-speaking Caribbean, only Argentina, Panama, Mexico, and Nicaragua conduct relatively normal relations through resident ambassadors in Havana. Use of Panama as a transit point for Colombian guerrillas, however, led Panama to reassess its relations with Cuba and resulted in sharp public criticism of Cuba's manifest disregard for international standards of political coexistence by a high Panamanian government official. That concludes the matter. This was published by the United States Department of State, Bureau of Public Affairs, Office of Public Communication, Editorial Division, Washington, D.C., December 1981. The editor was Norman Howard. This material is in the public domain and may be reproduced without permission. Citation of this source is appreciated. So what we see in the postscript, ladies and gentlemen, is we see where a number of South American governments turned on Cuba and rejected its authority. These governments include Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Jamaica, and Costa Rica. They all found fault with some of the implementations that Cuba had made during this time and saw its influence in their countries as deleterious. And apparently, Argentina, as opposed as of the writing of this journal, Argentina, Panama, Mexico, Nicaraguan, and that's pretty much it. Had normal relations with Cuba. Now the former the countries that I named that rejected Cuban authority didn't entirely, except for maybe Jamaica, didn't entirely stop their relations with Cuba, but they sort of kept Cuba at a distance diplomatically and sort of loosened their alliance with Cuba, as opposed to simply getting rid of them as it were, as a strategic ally. They maintained some communication, but the communication was greatly diminished when Cuba started blowing up Bahamian patrol boats. That angered the United States. And Cuba's strategic allies in the Spanish-speaking world were saying to Cuba, what the hell are you doing? Okay, what are you doing blowing up Bahamian naval vessels, knowing how intimate the United States was in supplying those Bahamian vessels to those districts? Okay, I mean, these countries that Cuba had just established diplomatic and political relationships with were still very young. Okay, they were not prepared for a military scuffle with the United States. I mean, it was bringing bad heat on them. It's like, we've just established these diplomatic ties with you, Cuba. We have signed treatises with you. We have signed diplomatic agreements with you. Okay? Our destiny and your destiny are intertwined right now. As strategic partners, your country and our country are politically linked now. Not only politically, but economically. And you go and blow up Bahamian naval vessels right afterwards. And they were like, we're going to have to diminish our relationship with you because we don't condone your actions against these Bahamians. Okay? Cuban MiGs were harassing U.S. Coast Guard aircrafts. What are you trying to do, Cuba? Are you trying to get an atomic bomb dropped? You see, that was their collective thinking. We are establishing a new future for South American, Central American, and Caribbean people. We're looking towards the future. We're testing out this communist ideology. We are establishing normalized ties with the Soviet Union through Cuba. And you threaten to destroy that right away by blowing up Bahamian naval vessels and harassing U.S. Coast Guard aircrafts. So they were like, well, maybe this Cuba thing is not going to be as airtight as we thought it would be. We're going to have to start distancing ourselves from Cuba in various capacities and start strengthening ties with each other. Because Cuba had sort of this renegade persona going on. And, you know, I mean, just think of it, ladies and gentlemen. They're harassing U.S. Coast Guard aircrafts. And blowing up Bahamian naval vessels. Okay, they're likely to have gotten invaded. And it wouldn't have been difficult either. The United States could have easily invaded Cuba after that and annexed it. And made it the 51st state of the United States. The United States could have accomplished that easily. Now, mind you, the Soviet Union would have stepped in, right? Perhaps some other countries from the communist political philosophy would have stepped in and assisted Cuba. But I mean, annexation wouldn't have been that much of a mountain climb for the United States in 1981, right? And you know, it might have annexed Puerto Rico. All right, and we'd be talking about Cuba and Puerto Rico as the 51st and 52nd states. I mean, that's how much of a discrepancy there was between the U.S. military power and Cuba's military power. Okay, and mind you, if Cuba, I mean, it might have been at the behest of the Soviet Union, but keep something in mind: it was Cuba that was doing the harassment. So the United States could have took that to heart, but they didn't. The United States has always been real soft on Cuba, militarily. Yeah, it's opened up bases there, but it's always been real soft on Cuba and always been real soft on Mexico too. Okay, 11 million Mexican undocumented people here right now. All right, Cuba, which was in 1962 an enemy of the United States, now has a majority population here in Miami-Dade County. The United States has always been real soft on Mexico and Cuba. And it continues to be soft on Mexico and Cuba, ladies and gentlemen. All right. You know, Cuba's come a long way, obviously. However, it's been placed on and off the state-sponsored terrorism list for 43 years now. Donald Trump put it back on the list just this year. Are there Cuban narco terrorists operating here in Miami-Dade County? Absolutely. Why? Because the United States has always been soft on Cuba, ladies and gentlemen. Now I have some closing thoughts for you, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I'm a political commentator. It is my occupation and my hobby to commentate on political matters. I have no doubt whatsoever that there may be interested parties here in the United States that may listen to this lecture and go, well, wow, Mr. Smith, maybe you should run for public office and fix all these horrible problems. Well, listen, and I'm going to try to put this as gently as possible. The tax dollars that have come out of my checks from every job I've ever had went to state and federal sources that paid the salaries of the elected officials that were supposed to take care of these problems. I'm going to say this. I think politics is a noble profession. Okay, if you are an elected official, you are front and center, and you are a very visible manager of public affairs and resources, and you are directly answerable to the United States Constitution, state constitutions, and the American people generally. I'm happy to offer insights. I'm happy to offer political commentary. It's my insights. It's my political commentary. It's political commentary that's indexed to the EIS Media Group lecture series and the Bible Discourses LLC lecture series. Okay, me, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, am the founder, sole proprietor, and CEO of these enterprises. I invoke my First Amendment right to the United States Constitution to say everything that I say now, to say everything I've said in the past, and to say everything that I ever will say. And I stand by everything that I've ever said. And these comments that I make, this political commentary, these lectures, they're based on my personal and political convictions as to the status of the world that I live in. Okay? Freedom of speech is the most powerful tool against tyranny that any citizen has anywhere in the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I identify as a targeted individual. I've experienced gang stalking at the hands of Americans and non-Americans alike. A lot of the country spoken about today I admire. Okay? I've told you in various other lectures that from the time I was a 10-year-old child, having first read the United States Constitution, to the time I became a college student at the University of Dayton in 2016, I was an admirer of the United States Republic. And I felt proud to be an American. But when I discovered that the United States federal establishment had authorized open-air disruption tactics, harassment tactics, biological warfare tactics, and occupational destruction tactics against my person on behalf of enemies that I've had throughout my life as a way to teach me a lesson, well, then I lost my respect for the United States, and anyone would in my situation. I can't be blamed for the loss of respect that I've had for the United States, and I will continue to communicate that loss of respect until this gang stalking thing is eradicated permanently. At that point, I will go online. I will congratulate the United States for eradicating the evil. And I will acknowledge the eradication. But as of right now, ladies and gentlemen, I remain a targeted individual having experienced disgusting acts of gang stalking just today by liaisons, undercover operatives, and gang stalkers who use a system of signals, verbal commands, vehicular maneuvers, and other symbols and cues to communicate my location to other stalkers who then descend upon me like a pack of wild-eyed hyenas. Ladies and gentlemen, my freedom of speech is an instrument against the tyranny that I experience at the hands of the federal government that I pay taxes to on a daily basis. Ladies and gentlemen, these matters concerning Cuba, all right, are of interest to me because the majority population here is Cuban, and I experienced disastrous gang stalking techniques against my person, and so does my significant other, at the hands of Cuban American undercover operatives who don't even speak the same language as me. Okay, they're getting verbal commands in Spanish through earpieces. Where my location is and how to pester me on behalf of the U.S. federal establishment of this country, probably the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI, who I have ironically written letters to concerning narco-terrorism that goes on in Kendall, Florida right now, and how to remedy that problem. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to understand that clandestine gang stalking is the political conundrum of the 21st century. And if you're a person in this country, the United States of America, right now, February 17th of 26, who hears any of my lectures and you're offended at the term gang stalker, then quit practicing it. What you are participating in is gang stalking. And no, the people who come forward about it are not psychotic, nor are we deluded, nor are we schizophrenic. We are patriots and citizens of planet Earth whose rights have been clandestinely and extrajudicially revoked. And we live this domestic terroristic activity on a daily basis. Okay, what makes it terroristic? Intentional germ spreading. That's what makes it terroristic. And to anybody who might deny these things, go back and listen to my MK Ultra lectures. All right, this government has authorized state-sanctioned disease spreading in the past. And the blueprint to these germ-spreading operations are still alive. So if you think for 1 second that the same kinds of people who put together MK Ultra aren't still in existence today, well, that mindset lives on. And these same kinds of people are actively involved in clandestine gang stalking to the present day, and shamelessly, foolishly, and with great malice and cowardice continue to perpetrate these evils against targeted individuals on a daily basis. Thank you for tuning in.